Okay. 1, 1, 2, 2, 2. Your level okay? 1, 1, 2, 2, 2, 2. 1. Alright. Okay. Try that now. 1, 1, 2, 2, 2, 2. 1, 1, 2. 2, 2, 2. Might be quite a low level, but that's it up full from us. 1, 1, 2. 2, 2, 2. 1, 1, 2, 2, 2. 1, 1, 2, 2, 2, 2. 1, 1, 2, 2, 2, 2. All right.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, good morning everybody. Chief Constable, welcome to you and your team as always, and also thank you to all those and welcome to all those joining us online at this July accountability session. I'm going to open with the issue of funding. Chief Constable, for many months the issue of resourcing has been the primary feature of many of our meetings, both in public and privately. We have supported the PSNI recovery business case, and in this room we all know the impact of the current resourcing situation: reduced neighbourhood footprint, reduced investigative capacity, slow response to non-emergency calls, and a reduced proactive presence on our roads. The recent disgraceful disorder across Northern Ireland brought that to a fragile operating capacity into sharp focus. We were all very seriously concerned as it was putting the lives of both officers and members of the public at risk. I again place on record board thanks to those officers who showed professionalism, and in the words of the Police Ombudsman's report this week, they showed considerable restraint in dealing with sustained attacks over the course of many days. We wish all of the 107 officers who were injured well, and we have also passed on our thanks to Chief Constable Farrell and Police Scotland for her swift response to our request for mutual aid. But mutual aid, as you know, Chief Constable, is not the solution, and it's not a sustainable solution either. As a board, we wrote to the Chief Executive in support of you and in support of the PSNI, urging that their funding is prioritised. We welcome the First Minister's subsequent commitment that the recovery business case would be funded by the Executive. But we now sadly hear it's a recommendation as part of a CSR monitoring round funding. I'll repeat what we said in our letter. The safety of our communities, and that is the safety of our communities, is too important to depend on the possibility of in-year monitoring for resourcing. Last week we published the findings of the latest policing plan survey, and there are some really positive figures, but the figures were also telling around the visibility of officers in our communities. Numbers are now, I understand, even lower, and if not addressed, we may have reached a point where aspects of policing will quite simply have to be sacrificed in favour of policing high-risk areas, as opposed to the current approach of spreading resources thinly across all aspects of policing, and that, as you know, Chief Constable, is in no one's interest. It is clear to the board that current officer numbers of 6,200 are no longer tenable, having a serious detrimental effect on officer health and undermining the police service's capacity to keep our communities safe. Chief Constable, what I can say with certainty is that we share your frustration, and we will continue to support you in the work to secure the funds so that we can reinvest in local policing to make our communities safer. I'm moving now to the important issue of officer assaults and attacks. At a time of resourcing pressures, having officers injured and non-operational has a much greater impact. As I said at the launch of the Police Federation Let Them Protect campaign, one officer injured is one officer not working in the community, dealing with community concerns. We fully support the new awareness campaign around officer attacks and assaults, and it is welcome that the sentencing guidelines around attacks on officers and other emergency service workers will now be reviewed. Police need the support of the community, and we call on all those within positions of influence to use their voice and work and support the police in their work. And this week's strong message for the policing from church leaders was very timely and was very welcome. We trust this support will continue in the weeks and months ahead across the community. Now, on the topic of violence against women and girls. This week, of course, we heard the dreadful news of the murder of Sarah Montgomery, and our thoughts and our sympathies are with her family, friends, and the two girls who have lost their mummy in the most awful of circumstances. We welcome that you have commissioned a review of the policing response to tackling violence against women and girls. Your report sets out progress with investigations and initiatives across a number of areas of work. Finally, Chief Constable, we are moving into a busy few weeks operationally for policing with the Open in Portrush, parades and other scheduled events. So if you can update the board on preparedness for the time ahead in your opening speech. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your remarks, particularly with regards to funding and acknowledgement of the work of the organisation in the last month. What I will say in your remarks, you mentioned 6,200 officers is no longer tenable. That's never been tenable. Never been tenable, and it remains that it is not tenable. I want to say good morning to everybody and to those, of course, watching online. So June has been an extremely challenging month, as I'm sure you're all aware. Tragically, in just the past week, my officers have begun investigations into 3 separate murders and 2 fatal road traffic accidents. The circumstances of each of these was very different, but the crushing loss felt by the loved ones of those victims is exactly the same. The lives of 5 separate families will never, ever be the same again, and the thoughts of everyone in the PSNI are with them today. As you mentioned, Chair, the brutal and senseless murder of Sarah Montgomery in Donaghadee on the 28th of June has shocked the entire community. Sarah was the mother of 2 young children, and she was pregnant at the time of her murder. Her death brings to 28 the number of women murdered in Northern Ireland since 2020. This is a profoundly shocking and depressing statistic. Our investigation into Sarah's murder is ongoing, but you will be aware an individual has been charged with her murder and charged in relation to her unborn child. That criminal justice process will now take its course. It was very moving to see the respectful and dignified vigil in Sarah's memory last night in Donaghadee, attended by so many people. Addressing violence against women and girls is a priority for this organisation, and we will do everything within our power to bring those responsible for this awful crime to justice. I promise you that. We have, as you mentioned, Chair, again witnessed widespread racially and sectarian motivated rioting and disorder across Northern Ireland in the past month. In disgraceful scenes, reminiscent of last summer, we saw hate-filled mobs throw petrol bombs, masonry, fireworks and axes at police officers, targeting homes and businesses. They targeted law-abiding, decent families from diverse communities who make Northern Ireland a better place, creating fear in people who simply want to live in peace. I can confirm the final number of injured officers as 107. 107 injured officers, many with head injuries from masonry and other missiles. I personally reached out to each and every one of those officers, and I cannot sufficiently overstate how proud I am of each of them. There is no place for such violence. These actions were not about protest. They were attacks on the very fabric of our society. What sort of Northern Ireland do we want to live in? The disorder followed a local protest after an assault against an incredibly brave young girl. Those responsible for the disorder hijacked that lawful protest, bringing further trauma upon that poor victim. 2 teenage boys have been charged in relation to that assault, and again, the criminal justice process should be allowed to take its course. We're treating every incident as a racially or sectarian motivated hate crime. To date, 56 arrests have been made and 27 individuals remanded into custody. More will follow as we pursue those responsible and bring them to justice. The deterrence of long prison sentences will be a sobering reality for many of those involved. I very much welcome the strong words from the District Judge in Ballymena and the early, robust action he took in remanding a number of right suspects into custody. Our own no-nonsense approach of arresting suspects with the swift release of suspect images had a further powerful deterrent effect. Bail decisions are a matter for the independent judiciary, but I can assure you that police will continue where it is appropriate to oppose bail for those involved in serious public disorder and attacks on our officers. I very much welcome Tuesday's statement from the Police Ombudsman, who's examined our use of force during the disorder, particularly the use of 32 AEPs, the attenuating energy projectiles. After viewing hours of CCTV and body-worn video, the Ombudsman's office concluded that police had exhausted all options before authorising the use of this force. Crucially, they said, and I quote, "In the face of sustained and significant violence, which resulted in multiple police officers being injured, police showed considerable restraint and a consistent, proportionate response. We will use the most appropriate tactics, including AEP and water cannon, to protect communities and my officers from harm. Our approach will be robust, and as demonstrated by the Ombudsman's independent scrutiny, it will be consistently applied. I'm aware of commentary suggesting that rioters are treated differently in parts of Northern Ireland. I want to be absolutely clear. We respond to public disorder without fear or favour. There is no difference to our approach based on the background or motivation of those involved. To suggest otherwise removes the focus of condemnation where it rightfully belongs, upon those using violence and spreading hate. I will always welcome fair challenges, this board knows, but it's crucial that we are collectively seen to be unequivocal in standing together against these cowardly acts of racism, hatred and violence. The restraint and professionalism demonstrated by officers during those nights of disorder was only surpassed by their outstanding bravery. The people of Northern Ireland are incredibly fortunate to have the officers and staff that we do. And I want to be very clear that on that first night of disorder in Ballymena, and I've spoken to community members involved and colleagues in other emergency services, officers of the PSNI saved people's lives, and they put their own lives at risk to do that. And we did not have enough officers there because we are not sufficiently resourced, and that has got to change. This disorder had a deeply personal impact on everyone, particularly our colleagues and friends from ethnic minority backgrounds. I've met with many ethnic minority community leaders during the unrest, including hosting an event that we did at Newforge, which members of the board also attended. I was immensely proud to hear of those communities' gratitude and plaudits for the PSNI. Many community members were understandably emotional, but applause repeatedly rang out for the bravery and support they had received from this organisation. To those who remain frightened, I want to assure you the PSNI stands firmly with you. We will not allow this thuggery to succeed, and we will arrest and prosecute those responsible. As you mentioned, Chair, in responding to the escalating disorder, I took the decision to request mutual aid from Police Scotland. This support was both essential and deeply appreciated. Those officers who joined us were exceptional. I'm deeply grateful to Chief Constable Joe Farrell of Police Scotland, and I particularly want to thank our officers for agreeing to extend their deployment because of the ongoing nature of what we faced. That mutual aid was required and again highlights the unacceptable fragility of our own resourcing. I'll mention again having 107 officers injured during that period and the significant responsibilities we now have ahead of us in the summer months. Our reliance on external support has never been more apparent. I am, of course, grateful to the Justice and Finance Ministers and Executive for agreeing £5 million of funding to cover the additional costs of policing the disorder. However, this is merely emergency relief, not a solution to the PS9 budgetary issues. If we were properly funded, we would not need this money. I've repeatedly sounded alarm bells regarding our inadequate funding, which continues into this financial year, with a £21 million shortfall in our budget. No funding was allocated to the PSNI in the due monitoring for the recovery of our police numbers. Yet again, monies were allocated elsewhere. People continue to come to unnecessary harm because we do not have sufficient numbers. I will say that again. People continue to come to unnecessary harm because we do not have sufficient numbers. I continue to reference the various independent reports of the HMIC FRS, the Criminal Justice Inspectorate of Northern Ireland, the Independent Reporting Committee and the Northern Affairs Committee, amongst others, that each set out the dire consequences of our low police numbers. Warm words and a commitment to the recovery business case must be followed up with actual and full funding. It was hugely reassuring to hear the First Minister speak publicly about the signing off of the full recovery business case, and I very much welcome further positive comments from the Deputy First Minister, the Justice Minister and the Finance Minister about prioritising the PSNI recovery business case. But I need to be clear on two key issues. Firstly, getting to 7,000 officers is not sufficient to properly police Northern Ireland. It is simply what it says on the tin, a recovery from where we are now. The organisation should be closer to 8,000 officers and 3,000 staff. Secondly, we need the full funding of the business case. No ifs, no buts, no words. I'm recruiting at risk for the uplift on the basis that the first year of funding of £7 million is coming. But I repeat again, we have a £21 million funding shortfall, of which £7 million is for recruitment. Moving on, I was proud this month to support the excellent Police Federation for Northern Ireland's Let's Protect Them campaign, launched in Stormont. I want to especially praise the Federation for their hard work in supporting our assaulted officers, including the fact they reached out to every one of the injured officers in the recent disorder. While our people expect danger, they should never face violence simply for doing their job. Yet every year, hundreds of assaults and ramming of vehicles are directed at my officers and staff. These attacks injure colleagues, distress their families and reduce our ability to serve the public when officers are off recovering. I will use every tactic at my disposal to address assaults against my officers and staff. Returning to the issue of violence against women and girls. As you mentioned, Chair, I've commissioned an independent review by Rachel Langdale, King's Counsel. This will benchmark the PSNI's policy, data, culture and practices in tackling domestic abuse, violence against women and girls and misogyny. I'm determined this review will deliver real change, embedding a victim and survivor centred practice and reinforcing a zero tolerance to these issues. A final report and recommendations will be shared with the Policing Board, which I expect to be in the autumn. I welcome the Policing Board's recently published Northern Ireland Policing Plan Survey, which offers important insights into public perceptions of safety, confidence and engagement. This is a key accountability measure which helps us reflect honestly on where we are succeeding and where we must do better. It's really encouraging that over 91% of people felt safe in their communities and that nearly 3/4 view the PSNI as effective or very effective in keeping them safe. Frankly, set against our resourcing, this is remarkable, if not a miracle. The findings reinforce what we already know, that visibility matters. 6 in 10 people report not seeing enough police in their area. The public's message is clear. They want to see more of us and need us to be there when it matters. That is our goal too. Despite the ongoing resource challenges and abstractions to respond to disorder, our officers and staff continue to serve communities brilliantly. My accountability report highlights examples of excellent police work being delivered across the country. This is the reality of day-to-day policing here. PS9 officers and staff positively making a difference to people's lives. Mostly this happens without fanfare or recognition, but is life-changing to victims and communities. I am incredibly proud of this workforce, and so should we all be. I was delighted to see a number of our people recognised in the King's Birthday Honours. 7 officers and staff, in fact, were awarded for outstanding service, dedication and commitment to public safety. These honours reflect not just individual accomplishments, but the professionalism and the values that define this organisation. On behalf of the entire service, I offer heartfelt congratulations to those officers and staff. So having described the huge challenges faced by the PS9 in June, we now have the resource intensive and often incredibly challenging month of July ahead. This police service faces a myriad of complex issues that are unique, many related to policing a post-conflict society that no other policing organisation faces. The evidence for the PS9 to be funded properly is overwhelming. Nobody can argue with it. So please, no more warm words, no more political this, that and the other. Can we all just make sure we work shoulder to shoulder to make sure this organisation is properly funded? Chair, I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you, Chief Constable. And could I also add the congratulations of this board to officers and staff who were recognised in the King's Honours list, and also say that the swift response in arrests made in various criminality that we've seen over the last month in particular is commendable. So thank you for that. I'm going to open with a question from Keith Buchanan on the recent disorder and injuries to officers.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Chief Constable, for your remarks. The Chair and yourself, Chief Constable, referred to 107 injured officers, and my thoughts are with all those. And I suppose my question is, you touched on the type of injuries that were received by that. Could you give us a bit of a breakdown broadly of what the injuries were to those 107, and how many of those is not on duty because of those injuries?
So the injuries, the most concerning injuries, Keith, obviously the head injuries, and I just want to give you some context on that. A number of the officers I spoke to last August who received head injuries. One example is an officer was told he should stay off for 2 weeks. Because they feel this vocational approach to policing, he stayed off a week. He went to see his GP again because he had another head injury, who said, you really need to stay off work. You do not take any risk with head injuries. And we had officers during this disorder, because of the protracted nature of it, who received a number of injuries over a number of evenings because we've got such a thin green line of people who we can put into these challenging situations. I'm happy to report that most of those officers are at work. I can give you the details because it's a changing number of those who remain off work. The ones that are off work predominantly are head injuries. But we saw injuries from masonry, fireworks, a number of officers, because of the nature of dealing with disorder and moving forward and backwards, and the rubble that's on the ground, were subject to injuries of literally going down because of that and trying to move around as they needed to. So in talking to each of them, I have to tell you, and I'll reinforce this, their determination to be in the workplace, because they realise that if they're not there, it puts more pressure on a diminishing workforce, was inspirational. But in the phone calls I made, because of the people I spoke to that was concerned about their reactions to me on the telephone, I actually sent round people to see them to make sure they would get the proper medical care. This can't go on. I do want to reassure you, though, that I make these calls, but so many other things are in place now to support these officers. Each of their supervisors reaches into them to make sure they're okay. We have a peer support group who are volunteers, who are operational police officers and staff, who basically triage what they have experienced and any psychological impact around any further follow-up support that they might need. We have a process now where our human resources follow up with each of them, and we do a health and safety assessment, particularly on all the forms that come in setting out their injuries, and obviously there's a focus there on head injuries. And our OHW capability proactively reach out to make sure anything those officers need they get. But my biggest worry about all of this is the psychological impact of repeatedly, and I've been here since October 2023, and there have been a number of incidents of disturbances, that these people can only take so much. And this is a societal issue. And I've been told that this is just recreational. These words are the most irresponsible way to describe what happened. And I'm sure a lot of people on the board have seen the imagery of what those officers face with regards to missiles and fireworks. This is beyond serious. I do not want to criminalise young people. I think people on this board know my position that we all make decisions we regret when we're younger. We're very impressionable. What's happening online now is leading a lot of people to do things that they shouldn't do. But these are life choices that will change the opportunities for those young people forever. And I will be unapologetic in going after them and prosecuting them for this. Because this isn't something where you get another chance. They're trying to seriously harm communities and police officers. Those that encourage them and incite them, we are particularly focused on. But if you go to these disturbances and in any way are involved, we will come after you. And that's a reassurance message for the officers as much as anything, because previously they felt that's not been the case. But unequivocally, that is the case now. Listen, because everybody at this table has got colleagues, friends they've spoken to who've been injured. I just want to ask if there's anything else people want to add in response to your question. Okay. Sorry. Ryan?
And just really build on what the Chief has said there. I mean, I sort of go for the majority of this, and it was incredible to see the sort of live time, the bravery of those officers that were standing in the line, taking some incredible punishment in terms of what was thrown at them and what they had to experience. And then at the same time seeing the wellbeing work that was done through our welfare hubs that were at each of the main places where those officers were being based, to give them some support during the time. And then that, again, very quick time, peer support from volunteers. Their colleagues have been trained to do it as well. And alongside us then the various staff associations, federations, superintendent association and others, to make sure that we were getting that right, or as right as we could in really difficult circumstances. And that kind of remains a really key focus of our objectives as we try and work through this, is the well-being into this medium term of those that have been involved in this, and we'll be debriefing it to see what we can learn from what's happened in terms of officer injuries, etc., and be an important part of what steps we need to look at next.
Thank you, Ran. You go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up on that. Obviously, Chief Constable, we witnessed things in Ballymena, Portadown, Londonderry and other areas across Northern Ireland. What's the intelligence picture going forward that anything else like that could erupt in other areas? You know, what intelligence are you picking up? Thanks.
So at the moment, I cautiously tell you with regards to events that are going to happen in the next couple of weeks and the parade season, obviously the 11th and 12th. We are hopeful and working with lots of partners that we will see a community-focused number of events that families can enjoy. We are hoping, but very vigilant with regards to any signs that there is an intention to bring trouble to those events. But we're hopeful that we'll have a very successful series of events in the same way as we saw last summer, last July. So we are not complacent, but as things stand this morning, we review this on a daily basis. What we're seeing is that people are intent on making sure the events in July are peaceful, community focused, for everybody to enjoy. And that's what we want to see. You will know that the smallest thing can spark these issues almost at a moment's notice. You never know what incident might occur today or tomorrow where misrepresented information is put online that people accept as the truth when it often isn't, that leads to these sorts of events. So I just really caution people. And I mentioned when the disorder broke out and we had a meeting, myself and the chair, with the media. Much of the media reporting about the incitement and the people who are encouraging people to come out, we've done some analysis on that, and it came from overseas. People who know nothing about Northern Ireland, know nothing about Portadown, Londonderry, Ballymena. So please do not take what you see on these social media networks as being correct, because more than often it's absolute nonsense. And in my opening remarks, I talked about two tragic incidents: the murder of Sarah and the attack on this young teenage girl. In both those cases, there was a swift criminal justice process. We did our job, let the courts do their job, let the criminal justice process occur, and don't react in this way, because this is not the way civilised society reacts. And that's a plea to everybody to stop people coming out to act in this way. It's happened too often in Northern Ireland, and something's got to stop it. I don't know what will stop it. It might just be a thing over time that it lessens, but it's incumbent on all of us to work really hard to make sure these young people do not react in this way. And that's from all communities where we have problems with young people reacting in this way.
Thank you. I have a supplementary on that from Linda.
Thank you to the Chief Constable for your answer in relation to that. And just to reiterate some of what Keith has said in terms of our thoughts are obviously with the families who were attacked and the police officers who were attacked and all of those who are still suffering as a result of that by what were essentially racists or people who were being incited by racists. So just in your report, you did ask for that political leaders stand together against the hateful acts, and I think that is a fair ask. So let me be clear, as a political leader in what is a very diverse community, that there will never be a circumstance where it's acceptable to attack our neighbours, our friends, the people who live in our community, much less using an attack on a young woman, an attack on women and girls as an excuse, because we have seen this weekend that, again, not that we needed to see it again, because as you've already said, we've already seen it 27 times in the last 5 years, that the most dangerous place for any woman or child in the north of Ireland and across these islands is in their own home, at the hands of someone they know, usually a partner and an ex-partner. And I think it's worth saying that again. Just in terms of the actual policing operation then in relation to the violence, can I just get clarity that it is my understanding that there was an operational decision to instruct officers not to intervene unless life was at immediate risk. Was that right across all districts? Was that across the board, wherever those incidents were taking place?
So I'll bring Ryan in, who might be helpful on that. I think in a particular local instance, an officer, senior officer, because of the nature of what we were seeing, did advise officers not to intervene unless there was a risk to life. And when you've got an escalating situation like this, I can understand those comments. That was a localised comment, probably because as well, contributed to by the fact that not sufficient resources are available to go to assist officers. And you'll understand when we do brigade what resources we've got. We can't then send them to all these calls because of trying to plan for what disorder may break out. And unfortunately, because of the geographical nature of Northern Ireland, that disorder can be very far apart. So I know I saw some reporting about that. That wasn't something that came from me. But I'll let Ryan expand on that. He might be able to give you a bit more information.
Yeah, thanks, Linda. I think, as the Chief's mentioned, that probably refers to some reporting around the approach to a particular incident. There's certainly no blanket position that that's the only time police would intervene. Far from it. There are circumstances where, simply because of very limited resources, that what you would be asking the officer to do would put themselves in such risk and danger that assessing just the risk that's going on is really what should drive their decision making around it. But that's very much around individual circumstances. So just to reassure you, and you will have seen from what we did in terms of that police operation over what was really a week's prolonged disorder, that clearly officers were responding to much more than simply threat to life. We were actively arresting people for crime and disorder and disrupting them in what they were doing. So that was definitely not a blanket position, something much more localised.
Thank you. I appreciate that answer. And I mean, I agree with you in terms of the swift response in both cases, both the attack on the young woman and the murder of Sarah. So I think that is important, and it is important that we allow the courts then to do their job and allow police to have the resources to actually deal with the things that matter, and that is the attacks on the young women and girls.
Thank you. Cheryl? Cheryl, you have a question on this as well?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the update so far. And again, I just want to say, nobody should ever leave the home to go and do a day's work and be under attack. And again, my thoughts are with the 107 officers, and I do wish them all a swift recovery. Mine's just around the law and the guidance, in terms of someone attacking an officer. So do you believe that the current law has provided adequate protection and act as a deterrent in such offences? And do you believe the current sentencing guidelines reflect the seriousness of this attacks? And I know this is being reviewed at the moment and there's ongoing conversations, but just in terms of what would the PSNI like to see in this regard? What would you believe would be appropriate moving forward?
So I think to have a breakthrough with what we see too often in Northern Ireland, you have to have a break with how we do things. I think the biggest, listen, I'm a traditional cop, I think the biggest way to impact on people's behaviour in this type of arena is deterrence. And deterrence is swift criminal justice and robust criminal justice. If people realise the consequences of acting this way towards police officers, vulnerable communities, is that they're going to go to prison and their opportunities in life are going to change forever. They will soon stop doing what they're doing. It will reduce the number of people who are willing to do that considerably. We have been very robust in our response. I think we were last August, and we're probably being more robust again now. That also sends a clear message. We're not just going to stand there and let these people attack decent, law-abiding people who are adding huge value to Northern Ireland society, or attack my police officers, our police officers. That's not going to happen. We are going to deal with them. And I'm hoping, with the support of the judiciary, with the support of the Public Prosecution Service, that will enable us to demonstrate that deterrence. And I think the highest tariffs that are available should be imposed on those responsible for these crimes. I'm very conscious of some of the ages of these people involved, but we have to make a stand to change things. I do not want young people who are vulnerable and are being exploited by others, being criminalised, to suffer disproportionately. But we have to do something to change these behaviours. So I'm more on the harder end of that than perhaps many people.
Thank you. And Trevor?
Yeah, well, I think actually maybe some of what Cheryl has asked covered what I wanted to say, but I suppose, Chief Constable, you've used words about swift and robust. And in your defence, you've been vigorous since you came into post in terms of chasing funding. I think actually you led that call. Probably would never have happened. We'd never got as far if you hadn't made those calls. So you're not shy, but you use words like swift and robust in terms of what you would like to see sentencing. There was this creep of the suggestion of the two-tier policing, which you've dealt with. And I think the Ombudsman's dealt with that as well in terms of the commentary around that. Whilst many of us don't necessarily respect the Ombudsman's office and some of their conclusions, they had the benefit of the sight of all of the footage that they can view. and I think that's been helpful. But there's clearly a difference, and this is not in your bailiwick, but given the nature of the person you are, I'm surprised you haven't done this. But on one hand, you talk about the judge in Ballymena, but you make no reference to the judge that covered the courts in Londonderry. For me, the rioting in Ballymena is no difference than the rioting in Portadown, the rioting in Londonderry or anywhere else. And I think there is a difference within the judiciary, not the policing. So I would love to hear from you your views about how in one case a riot someone can get bail and in another riot they can't. Because I don't think that actually adds to or helps you as a team to prevent these things happening. So I would just like to hear the real John Boucher's view on why the justice system treats people differently in different areas.
The real John Boucher.
That's the new term today.
So if I can help with that, and I don't want to, obviously I'm not going to talk about individual cases, Trevor, but listen, we're here to answer the questions. You're here to hold us accountable. I appreciate this is probably more in the judiciary space, but the case of those instances where we had the disorder in Derry, we arrested 12 people that night. We were extremely proactive with our tactics. Now, without going into the details of that, which isn't for this public forum, that creates an issue with regards to the evidence we can present immediately at court the next day. So with some of those other cases that went before the court, my assessment is we were better prepared with regards to the continuity of the evidence to reassure the courts in Ballymena around the responsibility of the individuals that were before those courts. Because, and there is a distinction with the fact that we arrested these 12 during the disorder that night, there's a distinction between, I think, the level of evidence in those cases that we were able to take to the court the next morning. So those prosecutions continue, but I think that may have been a factor in why some of those individuals, and I have to caution, what I say, may have been a factor in some of those decisions by the courts. But of course, it is for the courts to decide. And every case has to be judged by those courts on its individual merits, on the individual circumstances of the individual, the circumstance of the individual, the age of the individual. So it's something that I'm trying to help you with. I don't have a concern from what I know. I think the courts will ultimately deal with these things consistently. And I think what I've offered you is probably an explanation as to why there may have appeared to be a difference. But if I can offer this in concluding my answer, we were more proactive in arresting people during the disturbances in Derry than we were able to be because of the tactical options available to us in Portadown and Ballymena. So those arrests tended to take place more as follow-ups the next day. And that was simply because of the opportunities that were afforded to us. So on the other flip side, I could be accused of arresting people at the time disproportionately to how we dealt with the riots in Ballymena and Portadown, because we didn't arrest people as much at the time. So all I'd say, and I did it in my opening remarks, I'm very happy, particularly in the private session, to talk in more detail about these things. But if you look around this table, nobody here operates on the basis of treating groups, communities, people from different religious backgrounds, ethnicities differently. Our officers, those officers I speak to, they just want to look after Northern Ireland. Whoever is in Northern Ireland, everybody equally and fairly. And I think that's the case for the criminal justice system, but there will always be nuances. And it's just a case of understanding why those nuances exist. And if we have got something wrong and we have been disproportionate, please hold me to account. But I think there's probably reasonable explanations for that. Okay.
Thank you. It's great to hear from the real John Boucher. Alan, you have a question?
Thank you, Chair. Chief Constable, I absolutely concur with the complimentary narrative there that you delivered on the help that you received from Police Scotland. But I was just reading through the Patton report there recently, and there was a sentence I'd never seen before in it, but it jumped out at me, and the sentence was, the Northern Ireland Police should have the capacity within its own establishment to deal with public order emergencies without help from other police services. And I think that there's a stark and damning indictment of successive political leadership that you're not in a position to meet that definitive aspiration of Chris Patten. And, there's a lot of backslapping has gone on around the Good Friday Agreement, but a blind eye just seems to have been turned to the failure of the political establishment to fully deliver the police service that was promoted in the Patten report. And I'm sure, Chief Constable, that you'll agree with me that recommendations made in the Patten report must be urgently honoured. I think the police, the public, and your officers deserve no less, and I think the time for vague promises has long passed.
Yeah,
I'm not
thank
sure
you,
if
Alan.
there's a question there, but
No, listen, Alan, I'm grateful because one thing that's often missed, the figure quoted that Patten recommended or the Commission recommended was 7,500 police officers. But what's often forgotten, and this is something Chris Patten pointed out to me, is that in addition to that, there was 2,500 members of our reserve who provided the resilience to deal with a lot of the disorder issues and allow us to operate when in main policing functions when disorder occurred. We now have, I think, something like 170 officers in reserve, not 2,500. The remarks in the Patten Commission that you've just quoted, I have quoted those to others to remind them of what the Commission said. When I arrived here, I suggested, and I know I've suggested it in front of this board, that a review, I'm very keen on independent scrutiny and reviews, a review of how we're doing 25 years on from the Patten report, how the board are functioning, how the Department of Justice is functioning towards policing, the executive towards policing. How are we doing? What's the health check? And it'd be very interesting if that exercise ever meaningfully happened. And if we're not doing things we should do, I welcome the advice and the scrutiny because it can only be helpful for all of us. But there seems to be a reluctance to do that. And I think some of that reluctance might be because people know what the answers would be. And I don't see the Education Authority asking for teachers to come over from England or Scotland. I don't see the health here asking for urgently for lots of nurses and doctors come over from England and Scotland. We are in a really difficult place. And we're not asking for anything that's disproportionate. It's a very, very minimal and fair ask when you consider what the grant is for public services in Northern Ireland. And I really welcome the warm words in recent days because of the tragic events that we've seen with the disorder. But we have to have those warm words turned into actual commitments around the funding. And that's for the 3-year position for the recovery business case, which again is very, very, very cost effective. It is not a big ask financially compared with what other public services have received over many years and continue to receive. And I know they have challenges and I know there's a challenging financial envelope here at the moment, but we're just asking for what's fair. Okay.
Thank you, Alan, for raising that specifically in relation to mutual aid and Patten, because that's important. It just shows the importance of the executive needing to focus on these things. Trevor.
Just a supplementary to that, Chief Constable, I think you're probably the first Chief Constable I've ever heard referring to the 2,500 police officers in terms of reserves, and I welcome your comments around that because they did play a valuable part in the past and they have a part to play in the future. But in terms of your recovery plan, is your recovery plan including the 2,500 part-time reserves? And if not, why not?
So we have tried to be really sensible around our ask because we are all aware, and I'm sure the board are aware of the challenging financial situation that Northern Ireland has. Effectively, I think the politicians here, the executive would say they're not funded to need. And we know the asks that constantly come in from health and education. So we've just been really realistic. And that's why I did point out in my introductory remarks the sort of 2 key issues. Firstly, 7,000 is a recovery to a position that we desperately need to be able to police Northern Ireland. It is not the final number of what this organisation needs in policing. My My plan is that in the next 3 years, we come to an agreement around what that number should be for both police officers and staff. Now, I think it is broadly 8,000 police officers and 3,000 police staff. If we'd kept pace with policing in England and Wales, it would be more than 8,000 police officers. But we have to be sensible about what we are seeking to achieve with the fiscal position that we're in Northern Ireland. So that's why we've only focused on the police officers.
Thank you. Just on that, the population of the country has grown significantly since Patton was written as well. Patrick Nelson has a question on funding.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and good morning, Chief Constable. First thing I just want to say is to add my thanks to that of the Chair earlier, to all of your officers who, as you often say, put themselves in harm's way to protect the rest of us. So I just want to record that to begin with. But then I want to mention that I quoted to you a number of months ago your own accountability report, and your response was that I should get out more. So I have. So I've been reading the Chancellor's spending review, which is, even more exciting if that could be possible. And if you look at the spending review document from last month, the Chancellor allocated some additional targeted funding to the devolved governments. And this included for Northern Ireland, over the 4 years of the CSR period, 113 million in additional security funding, plus 24 million for the executive programme on paramilitarism and organised crime. Now, my understanding is that these are sort of extra funding envelopes over and above the sort of the normal Barnett numbers, which reflect the special circumstances that we operate in here in Northern Ireland. So notwithstanding the recovery business case, which we've talked about a number of times, and which the executive can choose to approve if it wishes out of the average £19.2 billion settlement that it's going to get per year over the next few years. What comments would you have, and how much do you welcome the targeted funding numbers announced by the Chancellor, which I believe are slightly increased, at least, compared to previous years?
So thank you for the question, and I know you do get out more and more. So firstly, around the additional security funding, I really do welcome the coverage of the period for 3 years. Obviously, that's really important. So that allows us to plan more financially. What I will say is the 113 million over the 3 years represents funding of around about, for the additional security funding, 37.8 million per year. We were actually looking for around about 50 million. Okay, so just to give you a sense of that. And in effect, it's a flat cash settlement. So years 2 and 3, our costs will increase, but of course that funding will not increase. And that funding covers around about 340 police officers and 50 police staff that do all sorts of different roles, includes some local policing roles, surveillance, our air support, forensics, some of our specialist functions like dogs. But it is a fund that is only guaranteed for the next 3 years. It's not baked into our core budget. So again, that comes at risk. And the EPPOC money for the paramilitary work, that's 8 million over 3 years. We are already predicting to overspend by 1.4 million on that. So I really welcome these two sources of funding, but they do not in any way provide the levels of funding that we need because of our cost basis. At our last board meeting, 2 board meetings ago, we talked about legacy, the legacy of the past here. Since then, I've again written to the Secretary of State around the need to please sit around the table with me and the First and Deputy First Minister, the Justice Minister and the board to talk about legacy costs, because they will continue for decades unless we come up with a plan to deal with legacy, not just the ICRIR, which is where the current government is putting all its funding, but into policing in Northern Ireland, so we can deal with civil cases and settle them. We can deal with inquests that are likely to increase again and resolve them to the satisfaction of families. And of course, the ICRIR deals with criminal investigations with offences that occurred during a time period during the Troubles. We have an additional number of murders that we get no funding for. And that funding as well, with regards to policing a post-conflict society, doesn't include anything, for instance, like the protection officers we have to provide for, the close protection unit. So although I welcome the funding, and I welcome the 3-year window because it allows us to do certain planning that we couldn't do before, it is time limited, it is below what we're actually spending, and there is this big gap around legacy that nobody seems to want to sit around a table with me and talk about to come up with a plan for that. And the legacy costs last year would have provided us with funding for around about 400 police officers. So it does feel to me it's time that we all got around a table to try and address some of these funding anomalies. But I just want to bring in Davey, and it might be that Mark wants to talk about specifics around the amounts to you. Davey?
Yeah, thank you, Chief. Thanks, Patrick. And certainly, I'd probably go further than the Chief. I would say that funding is absolutely necessary. It's vital, in fact, if we are to sustain our work to protect the public right across Northern Ireland and indeed protect our own officers and staff from the very real and present threat that is still presented by terrorist groupings and indeed paramilitary groupings across Northern Ireland. So it is about us having the capability to continue to suppress the threat from those areas. What does that mean? It means that yesterday you'll have seen officers conducting a search in the Strabane area, a significant seizure, over £1 million worth of cannabis plants found, along with other items of contraband, and 2 arrests. So that's the outworkings of what that funding does. That allows the Paramilitary Crime Task Force to develop intelligence and to go and deliver in terms of executive action against those groups that would do us harm. It also permits us some degree of capability around medium-term planning in respect of our strategy in terms of Northern Ireland-related terrorism and indeed other threats here in Northern Ireland. You know, we can't do that on a year-by-year basis without a commitment in terms of that longer-term ability of access to those fundings. And our strategy is built on the principles of clear, hold and build. What does that mean? You know, for me, the clear is about dismantling and disrupting those terrorist organisations and those paramilitary organisations. So that's primarily led by detectives in Terrorist Investigation Unit, our specialist detectives, right across serious and organised crime branch and the Paramilitary Crime Task Force. Then coming in behind that, the ability to hold those areas, to stabilise those areas. So linking into our neighbourhood teams, our local policing, and the ability to provide that visible, responsive policing in those communities. And then build to strengthen the community resilience in respect of communities and their ability to withstand that repeated cycle around paramilitary influence. And that funding is utilised around policing of the community projects, engagement activity, etc., to try and embed that community empowerment across those communities. So that funding allows for an alignment across all those different elements of both the organisation internally, but also how we connect to communities externally. And as the Chief said, you know, just under 400 posts that are actually funded by that sort of funding stream. So without that, again, the pressures in terms of main grant and existing officers would be really significant, and we just would not be in a position to deliver the same level of attention to those areas. So it funds people from detectives right through to neighbourhood officers. It funds our IT support and technical support around those investigations. It funds specialist equipment, including our air support to a degree. Significant overtime for operations in respect of those threats. Forensics, as the Chief said, dogs, search capability, and also that element of working with communities through Policing with the Community Fund and EPOC, etc. the Chief did mention that our bid was for significantly more than this, because we recognise that we need to sort of invest to save for the future around some of these capabilities, particularly around some of our IT infrastructure that is approaching end of life in this regard. So we need to future-proof what we have and our ability to continue to suppress those threats, but also to allow us to respond to new and emerging threats in terms of extreme right-wing, extreme Islamic terrorism, counter-state terrorism, all of those issues that will impact on people in Northern Ireland.
Thank you. Okay. And just before I move to the next question, just to add that in relation to the round table meeting that you were talking about, I too have written to the First and Deputy First Minister requesting that as well. So let's hope that comes. Sorry, Nuala, go ahead.
Thanks, Chair. I just want to ask a supplementary to this. And first of all, just a comment with regards to the funding. I think it's really important to reflect that words, yes, actions more important than words. But given that the Finance Minister said on the floor of the Assembly multiple times, following questions from Peter and myself this week, that we do hold feet to the fire on the commitment for in-year monitoring rounds. And I understand and respect with what you said regarding health and education and eating up the majority of the grant that comes forward here and monitoring rounds. But it is really important that we do work together and we have all parties, all executive parties round the table, and that is important that we do make that a priority moving forward. But I want to ask a supplementary regarding the executives tackling paramilitary programme and the funding then that comes from that following the spending review. And it's not always just everything that's, flows from Westminster doesn't always necessarily go to where it's supposed to be targeted. However, it is an executive-wide programme, and I think it's really important to talk about outcomes. And we at the board are privy to those outcomes at our committees from what the task force specifically achieves. But the wider public isn't always privy to it. And I don't know if the wider executive is too. And I think it's really important to note that there are more positive programmes than others. There are more successful ones and ones that actually have outcomes. And I think it's really important that the police are able to share the outcomes of the tackler and the PCTF, and that there could be a comparison at executive level of others too, because I think you will see that others that are funded out of that programme do not see the same outcomes, and I think that's really important. Now, we have access to that information because of sitting on the policing board, but I think it's something that should be reflective and worked upon whenever we are moving forward as an executive to funding that overall programme and making sure that justice and then the police can actually use it and tackle the issue.
So that's something I'd agree with, and I'm sure what we could actually do is put some more information in future reports to this board in this forum in the public domain around that. Obviously, the ultimate aim is that this society, we would not need additional security funding because there will be progress to a point where the need for it disappears. But I think until we get funded properly to be in our communities, to deal with some of the issues that you get told about every day by people in your communities that we're not currently there to deal with, we rely on specialist capabilities like the Paramilitary Crime Task Force, and some of their successes are extraordinary. But that's something that we can certainly, I think, amplify in future reports, Nuala. I'd accept that. I don't know if Davey wants to come in on that.
Yeah, well, briefly, and no doubt you'll have seen the work we did last week with health and with justice in terms of the communications around Pangea, which was in respect of illicit prescription drugs, just under 1 million tablets, pills, seized, taken off the street, in £1 million worth of drugs seized, taken off the street. So that's our attempt to bring to the attention of the wider public at general what we're doing, how we're doing it. Again, I mentioned the operation that remains ongoing from yesterday in respect of Strabane, and again, we will do all we can to publicise the activity that we undertake. We also work very closely as part of the Joint Agency Task Force, and we publish regular updates in respect of the activity on a quarterly basis undertaken by that group. So yes, we will do everything we can to demonstrate the worth and the value of the commitment, and if you like, the investment in terms of the PCTF and our work more generally. Absolutely agree with you.
Okay, thank you. Nuala, you also had a question on the Violence Against Women and Girls review. Do you want to put that out now? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. And I wasn't going to ask, but you mentioned it in your opening statement. And I think it's important that there is a review with regards to PSNI's work into tackling violence against women and girls to make sure that we are doing everything right, and the police play that opportunity too. But I have to say, Chief, I'm disappointed that in your response to the board, you came back and said that the terms of reference are already agreed, despite the board saying, could we have an input into those terms of reference, and that the work was already undertaken. I think it's really important, and I don't doubt where you're coming from on this, and I don't doubt your aim, but it is difficult whenever it is the police service initiating a review into the police service, and you will understand that the public will share that too. And the way in which we can alleviate those issues and ensure that there is confidence is by actually taking on board some of the issues that the policing board does bring forward, because we did spend quite a bit of time, kind of coming up with our issues to put forward to you as a board. And I wonder, is it too late now to actually take on board some of the recommendations or issues that we did put forward to you? I understand the issue and accept with regards to specific cases, because there is a time and a space and an organisation for doing that. But there are other ways in which we can work together to ensure that there is that level of confidence in the independence of it.
So the decision to bring Rachel in was entirely mine because of what I've seen, and I've dealt with some of those issues privately with members of this board around behaviours, not just cases that we've seen which we have got things wrong, and we need to understand the lessons from that, but also internally. Okay, it's a societal problem, violence against women and girls. So I brought in an independent barrister. In many ways, there's a similarity to my approach with regards to bringing Angus McCulloch to look at concerns about how we have managed covert tactics with regards to what I call sensitive professions like journalism, solicitors, NGOs. But this is an internal review to look at how we deal with the issues of domestic abuse, violence against women and girls, misogyny, externally and internally. And Rachel, who started her work, she's been actually engaging with external bodies thus far, and she is going to come and speak to individuals in this board to understand concerns that there may be with regards to particular cases that I know people advocate to. I've met a number of people with members of the board around cases that have caused concern. What we couldn't do because of the time involved is, and you sort of alluded to it, is do a review of individual cases. But lessons learned, we're very keen to understand where members of the board and other external bodies feel that there are issues that we need to learn from. So the terms of reference are set. The report will be shared with the board. I'm hoping it will be done by the autumn, and Rachel will engage with any individual members of the board that wish to speak to her about any of these issues. And I've mentioned you speaking to her, I've mentioned Linda speaking to her, I've mentioned Trevor, because we have dealt with, or you've raised individual cases with regards to the particular topic. So just to reassure you, there's no lack of openness. I think you understand my approach on this. And anything that we need to learn, I promise you, we will learn. And you will get the access to her findings, her recommendations, and you can discuss with her who you think she should speak to if there's something we've missed. The point of this is to make sure that we improve where we currently are. It's as simple as that. Okay.
And I said I'm not dismissing or ignoring your openness. That's not what I'm getting at. It's just that there is a value and a reason for a policing board, and it is there to not only hold the PSNI to account but work in partnership. So, I don't want any reviews to give the impression that, from the public or others, that we aren't doing our job, and that what is the point of the policing board if it's not to hold the PSNI to account. I just think, and with regards to the McCullough review, actually a number of members of this board actually fed in, and you then took on board some of those issues, included them in the terms of reference, and then some of the stakeholder groups actually then agreed to be somewhat part of it. But I think, perhaps that take could have been better here, because, and I understand and respect what you said, but also with all due respect, had it not been for members of this board to kick up such a fuss about tackling violence against women and girls, ensuring that the police ombudsman came into the policing board to share what they could in the constraints of their powers, I don't believe that we wouldn't have pushed this issue forward. And that's not saying that the police service are not committed, because I absolutely believe that you are, but I just think that there's also a time and a place for working in partnership, just like we did in the end with McCullough review, and hopefully we can take that on board moving forward. And I'm more than happy to meet with Rachel in the future, as are other members of the board too.
So I still stick with my position that this is commissioned by me for the organisation as a Chief Constable. The holding to account bit, in my view here, is when she does the report, that you hold us to account that report. As part of that process, she speaks to anybody on this board who wants to speak to her, as well as other external bodies. And that's the important thing when you get that report, hold us to account. With the McCullough review, I spoke to each of the stakeholders on the group of experts to secure their involvement, obviously subject to them being happy with the terms of reference. I see that as quite a different thing, if I'm quite frank. It might be that Rachel's work leads to other stuff that we need to do. At the moment, and she's including in her work, by the way, is a literature review. It's a starting point that I think we'll look back on as the beginning of the journey to try and get this right. But I promise you, there's no intention not to work with the board. In fact, the board will hold us to account for that report, and the board will have full access to Rachel to express any concerns. Okay.
Okay, thank you. And we can carry this on in the private session if we wish to. Linda, you wanted to?
It's only a very tiny point on Nuala's issue. I suppose for me, I'm more concerned about who else Rachel is speaking to other than me, because there are amazing people out there. So I would appreciate that conversation with her to establish that, and if we can be helpful in terms of ensuring that everybody that should be spoken to make sure that we get the most out of this, because there are people out there that, I may be vocal on this issue, but there are people out there who understand it and get it much, much more than me, and have really, really good suggestions and really good advice to offer to people in relation to the specific issue.
No, listen, I'd welcome that. And she has already started speaking to external bodies rather than the work internally at the moment. Okay.
Thank you. Davy, did you want to come in?
Yeah, thank you. And just with a mind on victims here, I think it's important just to emphasise and again remind and particularly speak to those that are watching online that we have made significant progress. We have made significant improvements in terms of how we listen to and support victims across domestic violence and violence against women and girls over the last number of years. We have created a bespoke public protection branch, which has just celebrated as such 10 years in existence. That branch is under the command of a dedicated detective chief superintendent. Those officers working within that branch are specialist detectives, and we work to ensure that they have the proper accreditation and support in terms of doing their job. We have increased significantly over those years our partnership working with statutory agencies in justice and health. We are now in year 3 of our Violence Against Women and Girls Action Plan. We have and continue to work with the Department of Justice around closing the gaps in respect of offences and new offences such as non-fatal strangulation. We have significant partnerships with a range of bodies and groups including White Ribbon, ONUS and Women's Aid. We have domestic violence advocates working in our police stations. We have enhanced technology and support to officers, including the use of body-worn video, to really enhance the quality of evidence available to support those prosecutions. And I just say that to again encourage people not to suffer in silence. If you are suffering domestic violence or violence against women and girls, we will listen to you. We will show you empathy, professionalism and compassion. And again, I would encourage those folk to come forward and speak to us.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Gerry, you have a question on dedicated illegal money lending officers?
Well, Carly, just before I ask, could I add my own voice to thank the police officers who put themselves in harm's way during that period we've been through. Continue to do so, and I hope that the recovery for the 170 is quite a huge number, that the recoveries come. I also, if the Cheryl let me just make it two very quick comments, just on reserve police. I remember this way back from the start, and it was raised to a number of chief constables before you. And it was diminishing from the start. They were left, 3M wasn't being done and all of that. My memory is that the argument was that they're dearer to maintain than police officers. And that was at the core of it, because of, it was explained at the time, I can't go through the detail now, that was the biggest problem. So it was raised on a number of occasions at different chief constables. And if that's true, then an explanation from that at some stage, not now, might be worth looking at. And just one point on legacy. I mean, all the members of the executive, all the parties are agreeing with your arguments around finance. They're also agreeing with your arguments around the increase in numbers. I'm not sure if they're on board with the 8,000, but certainly the 7,500. But the cost of legacy, as you're pointing out, is going to take decades. And the British government and all the parties agree with this as well, are the ones who have to, because the executive will not be able to. I mean, that's a fact. They will not be able to, especially in the envelope they have now, to be able to handle the amount of money that's involved in that. And the British government have taken a unilateral move away from some House agreement. So it's just to say that, put it on the record, if you like. Just a question, sorry, it was, could you give us a bit further information, Chief Constable, on the role of the dedicated illegal money lending officer and the department they work in, and maybe provide more information on the extent of illegal money lending in the north and where it's most prevalent. There was a decent report given by Davy, I think, the last time, but a wee bit more information that would help.
Thank you, Gerry, and thank you for the question, because this is quite a key area again, and I will bring Davy in on this. So in 2019-2020, we received funding, and the PSNI received funding from the Treasury to the value of £60,000 to provide a dedicated illegal money lending officer. Initially, that officer worked in the Med and the East Antrim areas, focused on providing support mainly to victims. In April 2024, the role was expanded to cover all of Northern Ireland and enhanced to include safeguarding, outreach to potential victims and investigative approaches. The money secured for that post in 25-26 is £116,250. It's difficult to outline accurately the extent of the problem due to it being hugely underreported, as I'm sure you'll understand. Part of that is due to fear of reprisals. Part of it is due to the stigma of being in debt, but it's also because victims often believe that they've committed an offence, so don't want to report it. We've done a huge amount to try and reach those people who are extremely vulnerable, including a recent campaign through Crime Stoppers. And although we've made progress in getting more reporting, I think we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg with regards to the numbers involved. So our assessment is that this is an issue that's rife. It presents a considerable challenge to all communities where there's any economic deprivation, regardless of religious or political affiliation or geographical location. And it's this deprivation that allows this money lending to continue and to thrive. And of course, it's not helped by the cost of living crisis that we're currently seeing. The aims that we have is to tackle this, and we prefer to call it predatory lending, by both criminal investigations and disruptive tactics as well. Many victims pay off debts several times over due to the exorbitant and arbitrary interest rates that are introduced and what people call as late fees. And when people can no longer afford to pay, on occasions we have seen victims then coerced into criminal activity and sexual exploitation. This again is a huge problem, and I know I do this regularly, but I have to link this to the lack of our physical presence in neighbourhood policing. This is where we can recognise where these issues are likely to be prevalent, recognise the signs of those issues, and by being in those communities, we can tackle these issues. We're just under 400 officers short of what we should have in local policing. This is an area that causes me huge concern because of our absence, and I know often the safety of living in Northern Ireland is quoted by many people because of the number of crimes per population. We're in an extremely favourable position. There was a telephone survey I saw the results of yesterday that suggested 60% of crimes in Northern Ireland aren't reported. I've said before this board previously that because we're not in those communities, I worry that crimes aren't being reported. This is a specific example of the type of crime that I really am worried is not being reported. And the consequences, and I talked about the criminal exploitation and sexual exploitation, are considerable for people who get caught by this. I'll bring in Davey, who may want to expand on that, but we are very alive to the vulnerability and the issues that need to be addressed there, Gerry, I assure you.
Yeah, thank you, Gerry, and I think it's really important that we do shine a light on this area. There's a direct correlation with Patrick's question around PCTF funding, ASF funding, etc. And quite frankly, this is an area that we recognise was real concern around illegal money lending and the predatory nature of that and the coercive control within these communities, particularly with those groups linked to paramilitary activity. But quite frankly, we have really struggled to break the cycle of silence really around this issue. But we are making progress, and that's primarily driven by having this dedicated officer. That's why we made the case to the Treasury and secured that funding to secure that post, and we've built on that over the last few years. They are now providing a service right across Northern Ireland. It's a constable based in organised crime branch, but reaching out right across the entire service. And we're starting to see some impact of that engagement. We're seeing signs of increased reporting, and that's broadly due to engagement with a wide group of communities, such as Women's Aid, credit unions, voluntary groups, charities, etc., that officer is now engaging with, sitting alongside, talking about these issues, shining that light again around these issues, giving people confidence and trust to talk about them. And as a consequence of that, we're starting to see those reports increase. But we need more. We need people to talk to us around this. So what I would say is that officer is available to engage with communities and with groups. And if any group think that they would benefit from that, they can speak to their local district commander or indeed our organised crime branch, and we're happy to facilitate that type of engagement. We need to break this wall of silence down. We need to encourage communities to talk about this, engage with it. We can then deal with the criminality associated with it, and we've already seen some of that starting to come to fruition in terms of asset freezes, asset recovery, the first Treasury freezing order in Northern Ireland this year. So I think that's the outworkings of what we can do to address this type of coercive control. But we have to break the barriers down that the Chief talked about and encourage people to talk about. So thank you for your question in that regard.
Just very quickly, I mean, you're right to call it predatory, but you did mention briefly there about paramilitary involvement. How deep is that? Is that the biggest part of it, or is that where it's most organised? So trying to understand where the dangers really come from. And just the last wee point, because you've mentioned it a couple of times, the silence and the people think that it's a crime. They themselves think it's a crime, the victims. That needs put out, at the core of this, because it's very hard to get information if people still think that they're in trouble themselves.
No, certainly that's the value of this officer, is that outreach, that safeguarding approach, but also to bring in behind that the support of the teams and organised crime branch. So there is still that investigative basis, but in a manner that supports those victims, because they are victims, quite frankly. In terms of paramilitary, I would say primarily this is driven by paramilitaries, and indeed this is funding paramilitary activity and those that live off the back of the so-called paramilitary name. So we need to stop that, but we need to start that work by supporting the victims, and absolutely these people are victims.
Thank you. Two more questions before we wrap up. Angus McCulloch's been mentioned a couple of times. Les, you have a question on that report?
Thank you, Chair. And yes, Chief Constable, you mentioned the McCulloch review of covert surveillance of journalists, lawyers and NGOs. Could you just let us know the timetable for receipt of the report and the process for the report being received by the board?
So I'm pleased to say Angus is here currently. I saw him yesterday working. He's drafting the report. I do just want to mention my thanks to the group of expert stakeholders that have been involved in advising Angus, because that group, I think, has worked really well. Obviously, I have had no involvement with them, but I know they have given Angus a real sense of the local issues and concerns. I'm pleased to say we anticipate sharing the report with the board ahead of September's accountability meeting. Obviously, no board in August. So, and I did ask him if I could say that with confidence, because you never know if things do slip slightly, but he assured me that that was his intention, that we should be able to share the report with you before the board in September. Okay.
Very quickly, is it likely to be a final report that comes in September, or do you anticipate a kind of interim report and then something coming after that?
I think Angus has made clear that, subject to IPT cases, he may wish to provide an update to the report, because his terms of reference requires that he doesn't look at those cases. So subject to that caveat, it will be a final report unless or until additional information comes from any IPT ruling that he feels he needs to comment on. But ostensibly, I would expect it to be a final report.
Thanks. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. Thank you. And the final question has been withdrawn, so that is the end of our...
Oh, sorry, Chair, that was Peter's question. I can
Do you want to do it?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Sorry about that. No, we were discussing the question beforehand. It's regarding the pace codes and the changes that are needed for the pace codes. We have discussed this a lot at Performance Committee, and I know the Department of Justice is wanting to move forward as quickly as possible with it. Unfortunately, there has been a delay at committee in the Assembly with signing off on the pace codes. So I just want to touch on the impact this has for the PSNI if we don't have that change to the pace codes, and the delay in actually any essential change, because from our discussions at the board, we do need it.
Well, I will hand over to Anthony on this, who leads on the criminal justice portfolio, but it is imperative for the pace codes of practice to be updated and accurately reflect changes in legislation and operational practice. Most noticeably, the impact on the PSNI involves our national security powers, including terrorism. So Code I is a new code for persons detained under national security provisions, which is required to support the LSA. So if they're not updated, we obviously can't exercise those powers. And I think the reluctance to move forward was with regards to the Supreme Court case and Annex L. But I'm going to bring Anthony in, who's very much up to speed on it. That's okay.
Yeah, thanks, Chief, and thanks for the question, Noah. I mean, firstly, stating the obvious, the codes of practice are really a vital tool for us in terms of how we ensure that our officers are applying the law properly in terms of the guidance that the codes bring us. In one sense, to give you some assurance, we have been working closely with the Department of Justice in relation to updating the new codes. This is the first major change since 2015. The codes obviously cross-cut all policing, but my department, Justice Department, does lead on it. We were close to having the finalised codes, but as the Chief has mentioned, the UK Supreme Court judgment has added some complexity to that. That's covered by Code C, which is the detention, treatment and questioning of persons, and specifically then Annex L, which is establishing the gender of someone for the purposes of search. So that's where the challenges lie at this point in time. So from a policing perspective, absolutely, we need clarity on indeed how the UK Supreme Court judgment on gender, how that interacts with PACE here in Northern Ireland, but also equality law, because as we all know, it is different from here than it is in GB. We have been working closely with the National Police Chiefs Council to understand from a policing perspective what those changes or what those challenges are. And again, we'll all have seen the Equality Commission here in Northern Ireland's publication last week asking for High Court intervention in this, so we understand how that judgment actually does impact in Northern Ireland. So it's a complex landscape that from a policing perspective we are working in at present. But I do want to assure the board that internally as well, in addition to our work with the Department of Justice, we have a working group looking at that Supreme Court judgment and how it impacts across policing, not just the codes, but other things such as access to stations, toilets and so on for changing facilities for our staff, to make sure that we actually support our staff in every regard and not just in the codes. The question specifically is around impacts. Those impacts, as I mentioned, do cut across all policing. I'll not describe them ad nauseum, but in addition to the Supreme Court judgments, which I've touched on, I'll outline a few. So Code A, which is around stop and search, the changes to that strengthen and provide greater clarity for us on how reasonable suspicion should be factored into an officer's decision making. So again, that code change would be very much welcome to ensure that we're doing all we can when we're infringing on people's rights. Code B is around the search of premises, and again, this updated code provides practice advice, as the Chief has mentioned, on how we would operationalise the new National Security Act of 2023 and amendments to the 2000 Terrorism Act. In Code C, which is the detention and treatment and questioning of individuals, the main key for us here is allows the changes to the code would allow us to use live link for interpreters, for the use of interpreters. At present, an interpreter has to be present in a custody suite. That's obviously really vital for us in terms of that change when you consider our population changes and the minority communities that we have. It's so important that we get them the right support and advice as quickly as possible when we're in our custody environment. So that change we need also. Code D is about the identification of persons. So again, this provides greater clarity specifically on how police take biometrics in the form of fingerprints. And I've already mentioned Code I, or the Chief has already mentioned Code I, which is around how we detain, treat and question those arrested under the new National Security Act. So in summary, the code will introduce a significant amount of changes to the landscape. It's not just about the UK Supreme Court judgment, but it is important that we continue to work with the department to ensure that those codes are brought in as soon as possible. And we very much welcome them, because you can see it will provide greater clarity for officers to ensure that we are looking after our victims, our community and indeed our workforce.
Thank you for that. And just currently, with regards to the powers being exercised, can we be sure that there's no legal jeopardy at the minute, or is that by introducing these changes what we will stop? I know that's kind of oversimplifying it, but...
Yeah, and that's exactly what we're looking for, because legislation has changed significantly since 2015, so the codes are outdated. So the updated code will allow us to comply with the law in terms of the practice advice that we're given mirrors the laws presently written. So again, just to sort of re-emphasise, with the new National Security Act, there is no guidance, there's no code for that presently. So that's a challenge for us in terms of how we would apply that. That new act is specifically around foreign state actors, things such as how we would tackle espionage, online attacks, protecting vulnerable sites. So to not have a code for that is challenging for us. So it is welcome in that regard that as soon as we can get the codes, we can apply those laws correctly and proportionately and necessarily.
Okay, that is the end of our meeting in public, and the next meeting will be on Thursday, the 4th of September, and we trust that the summer period passes peacefully. Chief Constable, thank you to you and all of your colleagues for taking questions and for their ongoing work on behalf of all of our communities. Could I thank those who have joined us online, and we'll see you in September. Before we go, we're going to end today's session with a campaign video for Let Them Protect, as a stark reminder of the impact of assaults and attacks on police officers. So thank you.
Do you want to have a go? Get back, I want to see her. Come on, what are you going to do? What are you going to do?
There are 9 assaults on police every day in Northern Ireland. And every injured officer is one less officer to help in your community when needed. Let them protect.
Where's your mind? Hold on. Where's your mind?
There are 9 assaults on police every day in Northern Ireland. And every injured officer is one less officer to help in your community when needed. Let them protect.
Thank you. And I know Liam's in the room today, and that is a campaign that was put out by the Federation. Thank you. Are we off? We're finished.